They say history is written by the victors. But the church didn't just win. It rewrote the rules of sin itself. Welcome, my friends of reason and curiosity. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because what you are about to hear was once enough to be burned alive for. Now let's open the book that was never meant to be read. When we think of sin, we think of lust, greed, envy, wrath. The 7 deadly sins, carved into our culture, our art, our fear of the flesh. But what if I told you that there were once other sins, ones that made us human, compassionate, awake, and that they were erased? Not by accident, but by design. In the first centuries after Christ, Christianity was not yet an empire. It was a movement, fragile, dangerous, alive. Its preachers wandered deserts, preaching love over law, mercy over fear. But when emperors found faith useful, something changed. The church discovered the most powerful truth of all. If you can define what is sin, you can control what is human. The transformation began in the shadows of the Roman collapse. Europe was chaos, famine, plagues, tribes tearing at the corpse of empire. People craved order, certainty, someone to tell them what was right. And so the church offered a new kind of empire, not of armies, but of the soul. It created a moral system that reached into every corner of life. But to maintain that system, it needed a perfect enemy, you. The human mind became suspect. The body, a battlefield. Desire was demonized, doubt was punished, and obedience became holy. Yet this wasn't how it started. Early Christian writings, now buried, banned, or lost, spoke of different sins, not against God, but against truth itself. There was once the sin of ignorance, the refusal to learn. The church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries taught that ignorance was not innocence, it was evil. To turn away from knowledge was to turn away from God's gift of reason, because knowledge was light, and light was divine. But when the church became power, that light became dangerous. If knowledge made you holy, then who needed priests? If truth lived in every person, who needed Rome? By the 5th century, sermons about curiosity had vanished. The sin of ignorance disappeared. In its place came a new virtue, blind faith. Don't ask, don't question, believe. Another erased sin was even more unsettling, the sin of silence. Early Christian communities believed that to remain silent in the face of injustice was to share in its guilt. If your neighbor starved, if your ruler lied, and you said nothing, you sinned. Speak, even if your voice trembles, the Desert Fathers wrote. But when Christianity merged with empire, silence became convenient. To question authority became rebellion. To obey became holy. And so the sin of silence was erased, replaced by the commandment, submit. Imagine how different history might have been if silence had stayed a sin. Would the Inquisition ever have been possible if every Christian believed silence itself was evil? And then there was the sin of power. Few remember that the earliest monastic teachings condemned not just greed, but domination itself. To command men without compassion, one ancient text read, is to sin against God himself. But by the 9th century, bishops owned castles. Pope Leo IV rode into battle in armor. The church needed rulers to believe that authority was not temptation, but destiny. And so power became divine. Kings were chosen by God. Their wars were holy. Their victims, heretics. The sin of domination was rewritten as the duty to rule. For centuries, these lost teachings were scrubbed from manuscripts, their authors condemned, their words replaced by verses about obedience, purity, and fear. Even cowardice, once considered a sin, a failure to defend the weak, was inverted. Peace became weakness. War became courage. The faithful marched with swords in hand, convinced that killing in the name of Christ was the highest form of devotion. And yet, beneath the cathedrals and Latin chants, something still whispered. Scholars began to notice the gaps, the erased passages, the contradictions. They found traces of a moral code that once made people brave, not broken, because deep down, humanity never forgot. Somewhere between parchment and ash, between sermon and secret, the old sins still flickered, calling not for fear, but for awareness. That whisper grew louder over centuries, carried by those who dared to remember, by monks who hid banned books, by women who healed when healing was called witchcraft, by thinkers who asked questions no one dared answer. And it's through them that we find our way into the next chapter of this buried story. When the Church's fear of truth turned into open war, the war not against armies, but against ideas. By the time the Middle Ages began, the Church no longer feared Rome's soldiers or pagan temples. Its greatest enemy had changed. Now, it was thought itself. Knowledge had become something dangerous, something that had to be contained. Only priests could read the Bible. Only popes could interpret truth. Ordinary people were told that curiosity was temptation, and temptation was sin. But behind monastery walls, some refused to obey. A few monks and scholars began copying books the Church had banned, scrolls of Greek philosophers, fragments of forgotten Gospels, ideas that hinted that the human soul was far more powerful than anyone dared admit. They didn't know it, but they were lighting a fire that would take centuries to burn. Among those whispers of rebellion were the words of early Christian mystics, voices that spoke of a God who lived not above us, but within. They believed that the soul didn't need permission to reach the divine, that the true path to God was through understanding, not fear. But for the Church, that was a threat greater than heresy. It was independence. To destroy it, they began a slow and deliberate rewriting of human nature itself. The sin of desire was the first to be twisted. In early texts, desire was not always condemned. Love, longing, even sensuality. These were considered reflections of divine creation. After all, if humans were made in God's image, then desire could not be evil. But the Church needed obedience, not ecstasy. And so desire became the devil's whisper. Temptation became proof of weakness. The body was declared unclean, pleasure forbidden, passion a path to damnation. And with that, half of humanity's spirit was shackled. Then came the sin of pride, a word that once meant courage and self-worth. Before Rome's influence, pride was not vanity. It was the strength to stand before kings and gods alike and say, "I am also made of light." But pride gave people power over themselves, and that could not be tolerated. So pride was redefined as arrogance, rebellion, sin. The only good pride left was in obedience, in serving the Church, in accepting one's lowliness. The proud man was cast down, the humble man was blessed. And thus began the great moral inversion. Strength became sin. Submission became salvation. Even compassion itself was distorted. Early believers were taught that mercy was not just for the innocent, but for everyone, even the condemned. But in the age of the Inquisition, mercy was seen as weakness. To question a punishment, to pity a heretic, was to doubt divine justice. So the sin of cruelty vanished, replaced by the virtue of punishment. And cruelty in the name of God became sacred duty. Through it all, one lesson was burned into the heart of every believer. You were born guilty. Your body was temptation. Your thoughts could damn you. It was the perfect system. No need for armies when every soul policed itself. No rebellion needed to be crushed. It already lived inside the mind, disguised as shame. But not everyone bowed. In small corners of Europe, strange ideas began to rise again. Ideas that sounded ancient, dangerous, and liberating. Some whispered that the Church had hidden older Gospels, texts that spoke of a more human Christ, one who never demanded obedience, only understanding. Others claimed that salvation didn't belong to priests at all, that every soul carried its own divinity. The Church called these people heretics, but they called themselves seekers. They believed there was something sacred buried under centuries of fear, a truth that could not be erased, only forgotten. And as that whisper spread through monasteries, through villages, through secret gatherings lit by candlelight, it would soon grow too loud to ignore. Because truth has a strange way of surviving, even when buried under fire and ash. And the more they tried to silence it, the louder it would speak. The age of fear was ending. A new one was about to begin. An age of forbidden knowledge, of heretics and martyrs, of books that would burn and ideas that would not die. And in those flames, the Church would soon learn that ideas cannot be excommunicated. They only transform. It began quietly, in whispers carried across the mountains of southern France. A few farmers, scholars, and wanderers started to speak of a truth the Church had long buried. They called themselves the Cathars, the pure ones. And though their numbers were small, their words were powerful enough to terrify Rome. To the Cathars, the world of flesh and blood was not the work of a loving God. It was the creation of a false power, a being of darkness who had trapped the divine spirit inside matter. The true God, they said, was pure light, pure consciousness, and salvation was not through obedience, but through awakening. They read the Bible in their own language. They refused to swear oaths, to kill, to own riches, or to worship the cross. They believed that the Church, with all its gold and indulgences, had fallen under the rule of that false creator, the Lord of this corrupt world. It was not blasphemy against God. It was rebellion against power. At first, Rome ignored them, but the movement spread. By the early 13th century, entire towns of southern France, Toulouse, Albi, Carcassonne, were filled with people who no longer feared the Church. Priests preached to empty pews. Bishops begged for help. And so, the Pope declared a holy war, not against pagans, not against Muslims, but against Christians. It was called the Albigensian Crusade. What followed was not salvation. It was slaughter. When the Crusaders asked how to tell heretics from the faithful, the papal legate replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Cities burned. Children were cut down beside their mothers. Books, written in the tongue of the people, were piled in the squares and set ablaze. The message was clear. You may seek God, but only through us. Any other path leads to fire. Yet, even as their bodies turned to ash, the Cathars sang. They marched into the flames at Montségur, 200 of them, refusing to renounce their belief that light could never die. The Church won the war, but the idea that every human carried a piece of the divine could not be unlearned. It reappeared centuries later, in new forms, new names. Mystics, poets, and thinkers began to rediscover what the Cathars had died for, that God was not outside, but within. In Germany, a Dominican monk named Meister Eckhart dared to say it aloud. "The eye through which I see God," he wrote, "is the same eye through which God sees me." Those words were enough to shake the entire foundation of Catholic theology. If that were true, if every human soul could see God directly, then the Church's power, as an intermediary, meant nothing. Eckhart's sermons spread like wildfire, copied in secret by those hungry for something beyond fear. Rome tried to silence him. He was accused of heresy, interrogated, and excommunicated after his death. But his ideas survived, carried by his students, whispered in monasteries, rediscovered by reformers centuries later. The same flame burned in Italy. A young monk named Giordano da Pisa preached that heaven was not a distant realm, but the harmony between the soul and truth. And later, a fiery scholar named Giordano Bruno went even further, claiming that the universe was infinite, that stars were suns, and that God was everywhere. Everywhere, even inside us. For that belief, he was burned alive in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1600. He died standing, eyes open to the sky. Witnesses said he didn't scream. He only whispered, "Perhaps you fear in passing judgment more than I fear in receiving it." By then, the Church had perfected its greatest weapon, the Inquisition. It began as a tool to root out heresy, but quickly became something far more efficient. A machine for thought control. It hunted not only heretics but ideas. It wasn't enough to burn a person. One had to burn the words that made them dangerous. And so, forbidden books were gathered by the thousands. Greek philosophers, alchemists, mystics, scientists, anything that dared suggest that truth could exist without permission. They called these texts apocrypha, hidden things. But in truth, they were only hidden because they revealed too much. Yet, the more the Church erased, the more fragments survived. Buried under sand, sealed in jars, hidden behind false walls. Scrolls that would one day be found in Nag Hammadi, in Qumran, in forgotten monasteries. Texts that told a different story of faith. A story where God was not the warden of human guilt, but the spark within all creation. The Church could burn the heretics. It could silence the thinkers. It could outlaw the books. But it could never kill the question that started it all. If God made man in his image, then what part of us was he so afraid of? And that question, whispered by the dying, copied in secret, kept alive by those who refused to kneel, would soon ignite the greatest transformation in human history. Because once the idea of truth breaks free, no power can cage it again. The age of heresy had begun, and with it, a war not of swords, but of words. The war on ideas did not begin with a scream. It began with silence. When the last Cathars turned to ash beneath Monseigneur's sky, Europe entered a new kind of darkness, not one of ignorance but of control. The Church now understood something profound. It wasn't enough to destroy heretics, to rule forever. It had to destroy memory itself. And so began the systematic rewriting of the human mind. Across the continent, inquisitors carried not swords, but ink and fire. They arrived in villages with lists of forbidden words, forbidden books, forbidden thoughts. They questioned midwives, healers, and teachers. They asked what dreams they'd had, what songs they sang, what stories they told by candlelight. And if any of those stories hinted that knowledge could come from within, that God spoke through nature, or women, or reason, then fire would follow. Libraries burned not once, but endlessly. The scrolls of ancient medicine, of astronomy, of philosophy, gone. What centuries had preserved, a single sermon could erase. In those flames, not just books died, entire worlds vanished. At the heart of this campaign was something new and terrifying: the Inquisition. It was not chaos. It was order. A machine built to identify, confess, and erase. Torture chambers beneath monasteries were not acts of madness. They were part of a system. Each confession, a confirmation that the Church's world was the only world allowed. Truth, now, was measured not by evidence, but by obedience. But knowledge has a strange way of surviving, and the Church's obsession with destroying it sometimes ensured its preservation. In Spain, as the Inquisition spread its shadow, secret scholars hid texts in clay jars, beneath altars, between walls. Some priests even betrayed their own vows, copying fragments of banned philosophy by candlelight, whispering prayers of forgiveness as they wrote. They believed that knowledge itself was a form of prayer, that to study creation was to honor the Creator. And though many died for it, they kept writing. In those same centuries, another silent war unfolded against women. For centuries, Women had been the keepers of medicine, herbs, childbirth, and healing. They had learned through generations, not from books, but from life itself. They knew which plants soothed fever, which stopped bleeding, which eased the heart. The church saw in them something it could not control. Knowledge outside Scripture, outside hierarchy. And so came the witch hunts. Tens of thousands of women across Europe were accused not of worshiping the devil, but of knowing too much. A healer who cured without a priest's blessing. A widow who read the stars. A midwife who delivered life instead of death. They were dragged from homes, tortured into confession, and burned. Not because they consorted with demons, but because they represented a different kind of power. Wisdom born of compassion. The sin of knowledge had returned, and for that, the world made them burn. Even artists were not safe. Painters who showed Christ as human, writers who dared to question creation, sculptors who gave the divine a mortal face, all risked accusation. It was not enough to worship God. One had to worship the idea of God that the church approved. Anything else was blasphemy. But the harder they tried to bury knowledge, the deeper its roots grew. In Italy, small circles of thinkers began to study the forbidden again. The ancient Greeks, the lost sciences, the languages of the East. They met in basements, in hidden gardens, in rooms filled with smoke and candlelight. They called themselves humanists. To the church, they were heretics. To the future, they were saviors. They believed that beauty itself was divine. That reason was not the enemy of faith, but its proof. And that man, not the priest, was the mirror of God. Slowly, quietly, this faith in reason began to spread. Artists like Giotto painted saints with human hands. Architects built cathedrals that reached for heaven but celebrated light and geometry, not fear. And then came the scholars, Petrarch, Dante, and the ones who followed, men who whispered that perhaps paradise was not beyond the clouds, but in the courage to think. The rebirth had begun, but it came at a cost. For every thinker who rose, 100 were silenced. For every book printed, 10 were banned. The Index of Forbidden Books, Index Librorum Prohibitorum, became a tool to suffocate minds before they even spoke. It listed names like Erasmus, Galileo, Copernicus, men who dared to say that truth could not be owned. But the church was no longer facing illiterate peasants. It was facing an idea too vast for fire, the belief that knowledge itself was sacred, and so, while one age burned, another was quietly born from its ashes. The age of heresy was ending. The age of discovery was about to begin. The world would soon look up at the stars and realize the universe did not revolve around fear, but around light. The world had been on fire for centuries, not with light, but with fear. And yet, beneath the ashes of burned libraries and broken bodies, something small had survived. A question. A simple, forbidden question that no inquisition could silence forever. What if knowledge was not rebellion, but worship? That question ignited the greatest transformation since the dawn of faith. It began in whispers, in sketches and notebooks hidden beneath church pews, and it would explode into the era we now call the Renaissance. In the 15th century, the chains of silence began to crack. Scholars in Florence, Venice, and Rome rediscovered the ancient world. They read Plato and Aristotle again, but this time without fear, and they realized something terrifyingly beautiful. The universe wasn't built for punishment. It was built for wonder. Artists became philosophers. Painters studied anatomy not to glorify sin, but to understand the miracle of the human form. Scientists gazed at the heavens and saw not a hierarchy of angels, but a harmony of stars. For the first time in 1,000 years, mankind began to believe that to know was to honor God. Leonardo da Vinci wrote that the pursuit of knowledge is the truest form of prayer. He studied flight, bones, and storms, not to challenge faith, but to touch the divine through understanding. Every brushstroke, every sketch of muscle or wing, was an act of worship, a hymn written in ink instead of song. But old powers never die easily. For the Church, this new faith in reason was more dangerous than any heresy before, because it didn't fight with swords, it fought with beauty. When Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he hid a secret message in plain sight, a human brain wrapped in God's cloak, suggesting that perhaps the divine spark was the human mind itself. The Church celebrated the art, never realizing that its walls were whispering rebellion. Then came the age of discovery, when men sailed beyond the known world. They found lands untouched by the Bible, skies filled with stars unseen by Rome. And for every mile the ships traveled, the Church's authority shrank. Because once people saw how vast creation really was, they began to wonder, why would an infinite God confine truth to one book? In 1543, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus published a book that changed everything. He dared to write that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the sun did not revolve around us, but that we revolved around the sun. It was the ultimate insult to divine hierarchy. If Earth was not the center, then man was not the center. And if man was not the center, then the Church was not the center either. They tried to suppress his work. They failed. Because ideas move faster than chains. Decades later, Galileo Galilei built his telescope and saw what Copernicus had only imagined. He looked through glass and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proof that not everything in the heavens revolved around man. When summoned before the Inquisition, Galileo stood trembling, accused of heresy. They forced him to kneel, to swear that what he saw with his own eyes was false. He whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Those words became a symbol for everything that had been forbidden, the courage to believe one's own senses over someone else's truth. But not all who sought knowledge were men. In the corners of Europe, women, too, began reclaiming the wisdom that had once made them witches. They studied medicine, poetry, and the stars. They wrote under false names, taught children to read, and healed the sick without permission. And, though history often forgot their names, their knowledge endured, quiet, persistent, unholy only to those who feared it. By the 17th century, the great reversal was complete. The Church that once defined truth was now chasing it. Its prisons overflowed not with sinners, but with thinkers. And its fires, once meant to cleanse heresy, now lit the dawn of science. From that light emerged a new world, a world no longer ruled by guilt, but by curiosity. And in that world, something long forgotten began to return, the lost sins, not as punishments, but as lessons. Ignorance became the enemy again. Silence became betrayal again. And the courage to think, once heresy, became the soul of humanity. But even as the light spread, the shadows lingered. Because every age of awakening brings with it a fear. If humans no longer need permission to seek the divine, then what happens to those who built their thrones on fear? The Church could not destroy science, but it could still shape guilt. It could still whisper that desire is wrong, that doubt is danger, that obedience is holy. And those whispers never fully died. They changed shape, became softer, quieter, but they still live even now. The Renaissance ended, but the war for the human spirit did not. Because truth and control can never share the same throne. The final part of this story belongs not to kings or popes, but to us, the heirs of both knowledge and fear. The world remembers what the Church tried to erase. But the question remains, have we truly learned what those lost sins meant? Or are we still afraid to look inside ourselves and see the divine staring back? Centuries have passed since the fires of the Inquisition turned ideas to ash. Empires have fallen, popes have died, and new gods, of science, of wealth, of technology, have risen to take their place. But the ghosts of those lost sins still walk among us. They no longer wear robes or speak Latin. They whisper through screens, through headlines, through the silent guilt that lives inside us all. We tell ourselves we are free, that we no longer kneel before the altars of fear. And yet, we still fear curiosity. We still stay silent when truth costs too much to speak. We still mistake power for virtue. The old system, the one built to make us doubt our own light, never truly died. It simply learned to hide inside progress. The sin of ignorance returned, not as a church decree but as distraction. We drown in noise, not knowledge. We scroll endlessly, consume endlessly, knowing everything and understanding nothing. The sin of silence returned, not as obedience to priests, but as indifference to injustice. We see cruelty and scroll past. We hear lies and stay quiet. We've traded courage for comfort, truth for convenience. And the sin of despair? It's everywhere, in the loneliness of those who no longer believe in meaning, in the eyes of those who feel forgotten by the world they helped create. We no longer burn bodies. We burn souls, slowly, quietly, with shame. But somewhere, deep within, the same spark that defied empires still glows. The same flame that burned in the Cathars, the mystics, the seekers. The belief that divinity is not a throne above us, but a fire inside us. It's in every act of creation, every question that begins with why. Every moment when a human being chooses compassion over power. Those are the true commandments, the ones written not on stone, but on the human heart. The Church may have erased the sins that made us strong, but it could never erase the truth they carried. That ignorance is death, that silence is guilt, that power without empathy is corruption, that despair is the absence of love, and most of all, that the sacred was never somewhere else. It was always here, in the mind that questions, in the heart that forgives, in the courage to stand alone when the world demands you kneel. The world you live in now, full of light, full of knowledge, exists because someone, long ago, refused to obey. Because someone whispered the truth when silence was safer. Because someone chose to burn rather than bow. Their ashes became the soil of our freedom. Their heresy became our reason. Their lost sins became our conscience. So, the next time you hear someone say, "Obey," ask yourself, who does your silence serve? The next time someone calls your curiosity dangerous, remember, once it was called holy. And when despair tells you that you are small, remember, the divine once lived behind your eyes. Because the story of faith and fear was never about gods or devils. It was about us. And the choice we make, every day, between the comfort of obedience and the courage of truth. The Church ruled for 1,000 years because it convinced people that holiness meant submission. But the lost sins, the ones they buried, teach us that holiness means something else entirely: to know, to speak, to protect, to love, to live without fear. The age of fire is over, but the age of light, our light, is still being written. And if those who came before could see us now, they would ask just one question: will you let their truth die again?